All right. So welcome, guys. Thank you for joining this evening. Thank you for joining. I hope you learned something new from DBA. I certainly did. It was a bit out of my comfort zone, but it was a nice talk. Next up is managing and updating firmware in a modern workplace. My name is Jente Vandyck. I'm a Microsoft Solution Architect at Vandyck. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can also find me on my blog, where I try to blog once in a while, although it has been some while because it's very busy time. So don't expect an active blog on that. This is my first public session and my first session at MC2MC. So I'm very happy to be assisted by Thijs Lecomte.
Thank you so much, Jente. So indeed, my name is Thijs. I am a consultant working for the collective where I focus mainly on security, but also heavily on the endpoint management side. Just as Jente, I try to blog as much as possible, but it has been a while, unfortunately. Keeping busy on social media, but also with our ebook. So together with a few fellow MVPs, also Michael van Horenbeek, who will be speaking this evening, I have written an ebook called Microsoft 365 Security for the IT Pro, where we cover the entire ecosystem of the Microsoft security stack. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about firmware management, but firmware management not in the traditional way, but in the cloud, modern workplace way. How do you manage it and what you do? So different steps we're going to have here. Going to be starting off, well, why do you need it? Why would you care? Because I think that's an important step. If you're here in the session, I hope you care. But unfortunately, not a lot of companies see the need to do this. So we're going to be starting off with that and then going into the complexity, what are the challenges. Next up, we're going to be looking into specific solutions. So we have solutions in place for every make and model, but some things are really specific for every vendor. So we're going to be talking about each vendor specifically, talking about how they rate between each other. And then we're going to be focusing on some really cool community solutions. And finally, what's next? What does the future hold for us? But starting off with, why do we need it? Why do we care? For me, there are two main reasons. One of them is bugs. One of them is security. So of course, bugs, it makes sense. Each update of firmware has additional improvements into the stability of device. Often when there is a really strange problem with a laptop, what will a support engineer do? He will update the BIOS as a last resort. And if you keep that BIOS up to date, keep the firmware up to date, you just avoid these issues that are coming up that could be hard to explain why they happen and what is the cause. But if you try to keep them as much up to date as possible, you will have decreased amount of bugs, but also an improved functionality. And of course, the most important part for me is the security aspect of this. Security it's so important throughout the whole environment, but it's also really important in firmware, because what is Jente showing here is these are 3 CVEs, critical CVEs, which have been released in the past 3 months, which have been affecting our 3 main vendors. So Dell, HP, and Lenovo. And so at the top right, we see the Lenovo one, for example. This has only been since April 20th. So it's only a bit more than a month ago, which makes it so an issue in the current time, so important to keep in mind, to keep it up to date, because a firmware is so deep at the deep level of your device. If a firmware is vulnerable, it is most often than not a critical vulnerability, which could mean privilege escalation to have the entire device breach a TPM chip, get a hold of your BitLocker keys, and get ownership of the device. So security and bug fixes can help a lot and should be on top of your mind when we're talking about firmware management. But of course, it's not always easy to do, and there is some complexity. And that's why we see in the field lots of companies who are daunted by firmware management. Why is that? Well, first step, it's a brick device. If we're talking about firmwares, a BIOS update, it can break a device and render it completely useless. It can either break the hard drive, the laptop won't turn on, won't boot the operating system, or it's just shut down immediately. So it does have some risk because you're doing it so deep level into the device. This is something which, in my personal opinion, has been evolving through the past few years. It was a really big problem like 10 years ago, but now it's pretty stable for me, in my opinion. Second, of course, there were great methods to do this. For example, in Microsoft Deployment Toolkit and NSCCM, we had driver packs, which we could just import and deploy and push to devices, which was really easy to do, and it worked pretty well. Now, of course, people are moving into the cloud to Microsoft Endpoint Manager, to a modern world, which makes that the old methods aren't valid anymore, and you need to be migrating to something different, which is yet again another solution. Third point is the amount of devices and the amount of vendors, because the way you update firmware on the device is specific to what tools does the vendor provide you. And this is where the main complexity for me comes in. Dell, Lenovo, HP, Microsoft Surface, they all four have different ways to update, and it's hard to manage. And first of all, COVID didn't help here because due to the chip shortage as well, people started buying other vendors, but also things like BYOD, bring your own device, is so extremely difficult and makes it hard to do firmware management. So having lots of different devices, both models and vendors, can make it pretty complex. And then the fourth point is that the reporting, Windows Update reporting is great. It's always integrated, so many solutions there. But you should find a tool which, for example, reports on the BIOS versions of your device. And these are currently, unfortunately, really limited. So why we need to do it, we have the challenges. We're going to be looking into specific solutions. I think we have 4 or 5 solutions, and we're going to rate them to see, okay, how do they stack between each other, and what would be our preferred methods that we as consultants use for our customers. We're going to be grading this on 4 things. Is it automated? Can we use update rings to make sure that we don't update all of the devices in the entire organization at the same time? Do we have some reporting to say, okay, how far have we been going? How are the updates running? And is it easy to use, or is it extremely complex? It needs to be easy for us to be able to deploy this to customers. So right now, the first 2 solutions are generic across all of the vendors. There are 2. One of them is Windows Updates. So Windows Updates is something which is generic across updates. And what do we have? We have Windows Update for Business. Windows Update for Business is a feature in Windows 10 and Windows 11, which allows you to specify update rings and say, I want to get updates for my devices, and there should be a wait date, a deferral date, which means I will wait X amount of days before I bring my updates. Oh, thank you, whoever muted. So we have deferral dates in Windows Update for Business, which means we'll wait X amount of days before those updates are offered. Windows Update for Business is not only for quality and feature updates, but does provide driver updates as well. And this is done through the UEFI firmware update platform, which is a common platform which allows us to push updates through Microsoft, through Windows Update for Business. Of course, this entirely depends on what the vendor is doing and if they support it, because this is a process where a vendor has to take a BIOS update, for example, provide it to Microsoft. Microsoft will validate the update and then push it through, which means 1 is there is a process which can take a bit of time, and 2 is that it can also be the possibility that the vendor doesn't support putting updates into Windows Update for Business. What is also a caveat here is that within Windows Update for Business, we have required updates and we have optional updates. Required updates make sense. They're always pushed to a device through an update ring. But we also have optional updates. And if an update is deemed optional, it will not be automatically installed through, for example, an update ring in Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And some driver updates are actually marked as optional, which is a huge downside for Windows Update for Business. Next up, version control. We have no way of knowing what's coming in. This just we enable driver updates or we don't enable it. This can be extremely hard to manage, and also the different versions is something which, for example, Jente and the field has seen that on a device a certain BIOS update came in with a specific version from HP, but if you looked on the website of HP, they had a newer version available, which means there is a delay in HP releasing an update and then putting it into Windows Update for Business. Fourth point, installation control. There's no way of telling a user or providing a custom experience to a user. It will just be that at a sudden time, there will be an update, you will reboot your computer, and suddenly there will be a BIOS update. BIOS updates is a flashing screen, as multiple reboots. There is no way of saying to a user to prepare them before the reboot, which is a downside. We have no control to have that customization to the user. And the fifth point, the last point, is also a downside, unfortunately, reporting. That's for specifically driver updates. There's almost no reporting available. So knowing which PC got an update offered or when was it installed, that's almost impossible to know. So while it is a generic solution which is automated, it doesn't provide all the capabilities we would want. So that's it for Windows Update for Business. What's next that we have is we have applications which we can push. So what we can, of course, do is each BIOS update is, for example, just a executable, which we can download and package as a Win32 application within Intune, which means just as Chrome, we push it and we have it configured all over the environment. While it is a solution, I have used it in the past, but it is important to know that it is a manual process. It requires also you package it manually. You need to validate it manually, set up your own update rings, which can get pretty confusing to manage the assignments to make sure you keep it all up to date. The installation is something you have to script. And so, for example, if you need to suspend BitBlocker before the reboot, you have to think about that and the script that you develop for this application. And of course, this is a manual process. You have to do this for each update. So this is not an ideal process. It is great for a one-off, but there's a critical vulnerability. You don't have anything in place. You need to be really quick. But this is not a solution that you want to have in place as a sole solution for firmware management.
All right, thank you, Thijs. I'm now going to talk about some specific solutions for some specific vendors and specific devices. And the first one I'm going to discuss is the Microsoft Surface device. As the name suggests, the Microsoft Surface is a Microsoft device. So you would think that managing firmware and managing updates for these devices is entirely natively integrated in Intune. Sadly, that's not the case. But it all depends on how you see the integration, because the only way to manage Microsoft Surface firmware updates is through Windows Update for Business. Thijs just talked about it. Thijs talked about the disadvantages. So all those disadvantages come with a Microsoft Surface firmware management. So no version control, no controlled installation. So I think, in my opinion, it's a bit limited because it's a Microsoft product. Microsoft could do this much better, even because in Microsoft Endpoint Manager, there's a Microsoft Surface management portal where you can have a look at your Surface devices. You can follow the warranty of the devices. You can see some information on the devices. So that would be a perfect solution to integrate the firmware management. So bad points for Microsoft in this field. To manage the firmware, there are some possibilities within Intune, and it's called the Device Firmware Configuration Interface. It's a specific configuration profile in Intune that you can use to manage the firmware, set specific settings. The downside of this is that it's very limited. When you have a look at the configuration profile, I think it's less than 10 settings. So this is not really an option from Microsoft. So I don't call it a real solution. When we have a look at the requirements we think are required for a good solution in MAN, you can see it's all green check marks, but It's not that good. It's automated deployment of new versions, correct? It's automated because we're using Windows update rings in Microsoft Endpoint Manager, so it's automated. The availability of update rings is there as well. Of course, it all depends on how we assign the groups. You create the update rings yourself by assigning different groups. There's no reporting. They told that the reporting of the update rings is pretty good. That's true, but we don't have a view on specific firmware versions installed. We can't see when a specific version is installed, or maybe when a version has failed. We can't see that. Ease of use, that's true, because an update ring, just assign a group and you're using it. You guys probably already have the update ring, so it's very easy to use. So for Microsoft Surface, there is a solution, it works, but it's not perfect. When we have a look at our different vendor, it's HP. At this moment, HP has the most solutions and also the best solutions, in my opinion, because we have multiple solutions. And the first one is the HP Image Assistant. I think all of you know the Image Assistant or have used the Image Assistant. It's an executable that can be run locally on the device or even from a network share. And when you open the executable, you get a graphical user interface to download drivers, download BIOS updates, and even control the BIOS. It's worked very good. Of course, when using Microsoft Endpoint Manager, we can't use the graphical user interface. We need something else. But we're in luck because the Image Assistant can be entirely controlled to command lines from the command prompt or even through PowerShell. So it's a perfect solution. It works very good. The only downside I think there is, if I see there is that we still need the executable. So before we can start using this, we need to push or pre-seed the executable to all your clients. That can be done pretty easy through Intune, of course. We can package it in a Win32 app, and we can push it to all the devices. But even then, I think that using an executable is a bit legacy or a bit old-fashioned. That's why HP came with a new solution, and that's called the HP Client Management Script Library. It's just a PowerShell module. It's a free PowerShell module, of course. Can be installed on all devices, and within the PowerShell module, there are a lot of commands that can be used to get BIOS updates, BIOS versions, BIOS settings, and everything you need to configure regarding the firmware. So it has the same functionality as the HP Image Assistant, but it's less complex. It's just a PowerShell script. The advantage of just being a PowerShell commandlet or a PowerShell module is that we can use it pretty easy through proactive remediations. At the first one, the Image Assistant, we needed to pre-seed the executable. We don't need to do this with the PowerShell module. So we just can create a detection and a remediation script in the proactive remediations in Intune. And we can use the detection script to detect if a specific setting or a specific firmware update is pushed to the devices. And we can use the remediation script to configure the firmware or to update the firmware. A big advantage of the proactive remediations is that we can schedule them. For example, enabling numlock on boot, for example, we can schedule this every day, or secure boot, we can schedule it every day, that when somebody disables it, it gets enabled again the next following day. So HP Client Management Script Library works very good. Of course, one thing, proactive remediations, they need a Microsoft 365 E3 or E5 license. They need an enterprise license. So for smaller customers with, for example, a business premium license, they can't use the proactive remediation, so they can't use the advantages of it. Of course, it's perfectly possible to refactor those proactive remediation scripts you made to just normal PowerShell script, but you need to create scheduled tasks or something like that to reschedule the things. So proactive remediation is a bit easier. For HP is HP Connect for Microsoft Endpoint Manager. It's actually a free HP solution. It's pretty new. It's pretty recent. I think Microsoft released like October 2021, so it's not a year old. And what is it? It's actually a web application that's built as a wrapper around the PowerShell module I talked about. So when we configure a policy within this application, they are going to use the Microsoft Graph API to push those policies to your Intune tenant, also using proactive remediations. The advantage of this solution is, if you're not that good with proactive remediations or PowerShell in general, or if the client is going to manage his environment themselves, the GUI here, the web application is pretty simple, so everyone can do it. So that's the only upside in compared to the PowerShell module. Works very good. It's free. So if you're using HP devices, you should definitely try it. The solution can be used to configure BIOS, to create BIOS authentication, so add a PIN code to the BIOS, what can be very important, but also to update the BIOS to the latest version or to specific versions. So when we have a look at our requirements again, this solution is automated. All three solutions for HP can do automatic updates if you like, or you can create a policy for a specific version. Both is possible. The availability of update rings is there because, yet again, it's just a matter of assigning the correct groups to the correct people. Reporting is limited. I mean with limited that the reporting there is through proactive remediation. So through proactive remediations, you can follow up what devices have problems and what devices are fixed. So it's limited reporting. You still don't have a view into the specific firmware version, for example, that are installed, but you can follow up what's happening in the environment. So that's step one. And of course, ease of use, it's very easy to use, specifically the web application, the HP Connect for MEM. A dummy can use it, it's very simple. So I've prepared a small demo. It's pretty limited because I don't have an HP device that's working with me. So I made a small video to show you the workings of the HP Connect library. I'm ignoring the HP Image Assistant at this moment because that's pretty simple, and I do think everybody knows this. So the script library, the first thing we're going to do, the first thing you see me doing right here, is getting the native OS firmware update service setting. What this setting is, it has something to do with Windows Update for Business. As you can see, the current value here is enabled. What this means is that this HP device is telling Windows Update, yes, please do get all BIOS upgrades through Windows Update. Of course, when you're using another solution, for example, the MEM Connect, you want to disable the BIOS upgrades through Windows Update because you can't get conflicts. So you need to disable this. And that's the first thing I'm doing in this video, just disabling. Very easy through the commandlets. It's just one PowerShell command, just run it and it gets disabled. The next thing you're going to see me doing is getting the BIOS version of this system. It's just one command and it will give you the current BIOS version. In this case, it's 1.55. The next command will get all BIOS versions that are available on the HP servers. As you can see, it's from 2015 until 2022. So all BIOS versions are still enabled. And with my next command, I'm going to install the BIOS update. Of course, I'm already on 1.55 and 1.55 is the latest one. So I'm using force in my command to force it. But as you can see in the command, it's pretty easy. I can do the BitLocker suspension. I can do the quiet and I can choose a specific version. So in one command, it's very easy to tell the computer what to do without encountering problems. As I said before, at this moment, I don't encounter a lot of problems with brick devices because checks like, is the battery enough? Is the system connected to the power? All those checks happen at boot. So it should be working perfectly. So that's the HP MEM Connect module. When you see when my command is run, I get a notification. permanent image that has been deployed, the process will continue after boot. So that's it. So this can be run through a proactive remediation entirely silent for the end user. The second thing I want to show you is HP Connect for MEM. So it's the new tool from Microsoft that is built by HP, of course, that can be used to push policies to the devices, only HP devices, of course. It's very easy. You just create a policy. Let me just create an example policy. You have a lot of options. BIOS authentication is used to add a PIN code to the BIOS. BIOS settings is to configure all kinds of BIOS settings. BIOS updates can be used to update the BIOS to the latest of the specific version. What's nice with the BIOS setting options is that it's possible to select your kind of device. For example, this one. Because HP knows all options of these kind of devices, you get all options that are available for this specific device. For example, something that is requested a lot is numlock on boot. Just select it, enable it, save it, and the policy is made. That's all. When you've created the policy, the last thing you need to do is assign it to a group. Those are Azure AD groups. They're being fetched to the Grab API because it's connected with your Intune tenant to the API. I just click next and publish, apply. As soon as I do this, and I go back to my proactive remediations, you will see that this policy has been created automatically through the MEM Connect. And in the backend, it's just using the PowerShell module. As you can see, if you scroll in this, you will see that it's using the HP Connect PowerShell module. So that's pretty easy, pretty straightforward, and works very good. So that's the demo. I just see that Stefan has a lot of questions. Does HP support BIOS passwords for PS Library and HP Connect? Yes, it's supporting BIOS passwords. We can even set them through the solution. What kind of notification does HP Connect have for end user? They don't have any. So we're missing that. Can the solution be used to reset the BIOS to factory defaults? I'm pretty sure it can. All right, so that was HP. Now I'm giving it back to Thijs because he's going to talk about Dell and Lenovo.
Thanks a lot, Jente. I think, to be honest, these servers are going to be looking bad, spoiler alert, compared to HP. This was a great demo by Jente, just showed how powerful it is and how in front of the pack HP is against Dell. How is it with Dell? Well, Dell is built entirely onto the Dell command application. The Dell command application is something which is pushed to a device. That's the example you can see here. And this by default allows for a manual configuration and updating of your firmware, which means if you install this, you can launch it and you can have as an IT admin, go over the portal, click install, and it will install everything in the backend. It's easy to use from a just hands-on scenario, but that's of course not easy if when you use things like Intune. How can we automate this process a little bit? As we can use XML files. So this is an example of an XML file which can be used to configure the Dell commands update. What will this do in the backend? This will actually say to Dell command updates, hey, these are the updates I want to push, which just provides an easier experience. So what we can actually do through the Dell portal, we can download these XML files for specific updates. So if you're a Dell partner, you will have access to the Dell portal. You can say for this model, I want to have this update, and you can just click download update, and that will contain the XML for you to have. So this is easy, this is doable to configure it. So it's not that easy as with HP, where we have the PowerShell module. Here, there is no PowerShell module, it is through the XML file. How would this look like if we want to integrate this into Microsoft Endpoint Manager, if we want to automate this a little bit? Of course, the first step is to have a device with the Dell Command Update application installed, which means you need to create a Win32 application and push this. The next connection is an Azure Blob Storage. On this Azure Blob Storage, we can actually configure the different XML files, which allows us to manually or through script upload these. And then it all comes together where we can say we have a proactive remediation running an Intune on a schedule each day, each hour, whatever you want, who will run a script locally on the device. And that device will check, is there a new XML file available? If yes, I will get the XML file, retrieve it, and then Dell commands update can do its thing, which means we have a pretty automated system through these XML files. It's important that this is not native. That's not a native solution. What I'm talking about is a solution built by a fellow MVP who created lots of great proactive remediations. As an example, I will link his blog in chat, which is where I got all the information from. And it is a great way to automate this and to have the XML files pulling from it. Moving on from updates, we have the configuration. So Dell command is an application which consists of multiple parts. So we have the update part, but we also have the configure part. And this is just an easy example to show you how we can configure the BIOS through a command line. This is not PowerShell like with HP, but it is a command line experience to automate some of the capabilities from your BIOS. So how would this conclude? How do we rate this? It is not a perfect scenario. It does provide some automation, but it is heavily customizable. So that's why we have a neutral grade for the automation and just a fail for ease of use. It is not something that is well built, that is easy to use. You have to use the community scripts to pull those XML files, download these XML files. So it is not an ideal solution. We do have some update rings, which is nice, but we have to manually build them. And next to that, the only experience we have for reporting is to those proactive remediations. So compared to HP, this is a big fail for me. Dell is really slacking at this time. The Dell Commands update is a great tool, but it doesn't provide the automation capabilities which we need today. Moving on to our latest specific vendor, which is Lenovo. Lenovo has actually 3 different applications which we can use to automate the installment of firmware management. So what do we have? System update at first. And system update is the tool just like Dell Command Update, which allows us to, in a GUI, get the updates. We also have a tin installer, and this tin installer is the same as the system update, but it is something which we can configure from the command line. And it doesn't require installation. So it's just an executable like the HP image assistant, which we can drop into a device and plug it in. And last but not least is we have the update extractor tool, which provides us the ability to retrieve updates and push them into a certain UNC pod or a certain web storage on a schedule. So now, how do we take all of those parts and put it into a MEM solution? It's first, copy. I think I copied and pasted here a little bit too often. So we have the Lenovo system update tool, which will be installed on a device. And the cool part is actually we have a ADMX ingestion capability where we can configure the Dell Command updates to be configured through an ADMX policy, which is really great to have just a regular configuration policy to push it through. So the ADMX policy is a great way to manually configure the application for Lenovo. And then there's a third part to this as well, is that we also can have an Azure Blob Storage and also the update extractor. So how would a potential automated solution look like? Is that we have the update extractor running, and that update extractor will, on a schedule, which can be configured, running locally on a server, pull in all of the updates, push them onto an Azure Blob Storage, and then we can say to the Lenovo system update tool, okay, look on this specific Azure Blob Storage for installations. So how does it all include? Well, it's better than Dell, in my opinion, but not perfect. We can have automated deployment. We can have update rings, but it is something we have to configure manually through the update extractor and to the system updates. So we do have the tools to configure it through, for example, ADMX, which is, in my opinion, a really big benefit, but the ease of use is still not there. And also reporting, there's no built-in reporting. It's again limited to only the proactive remediations or the ADMX files. So we had Dell, Lenovo, Microsoft, and HP. I think if we look back, that HP is probably the best in class, but unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. So I will give the floor back to Jente, who will talk about a community solution which could alleviate some of the issues.
All right, thank you, Thijs. So as you can see in the different solutions, the vendor are not that good, or the vendor solution aren't that good, and there are always some gaps in the functionality. And that's where the community steps in. There's actually a perfect tool, and it's called driver automation, the driver automation tool. It's created by the Cloudway guys or the Microsoft Endpoint Manager.com guys, and it's actually a user interface wrapped around some PowerShell script, around some PowerShell commandlets. This tool can be used in classic environments with SCCM, but with Intune, it only supports Intune BIOS control at this moment. What does it do? It's perfectly possible for the tool to work with HP, Dell, and Lenovo, and you can get a list of all your devices you support in your environment. For example, all notebooks from HP. Within the tool, you select the specific firmware you want to push, and you push this to production. It will create an XML file. It will put the XML file on a storage account in Azure, and proactive remediation script on the client side will get that XML file to check if there are specific updates for that specific device that you support in the environment. When an update is required or when an update is available, it will use a remediation script to download the updates and install the update or configure the settings through the native tools that are available for those specific vendors. So for HP, it will be using the HP commandlets. For Dell and Lenovo, it will be using their tools. That's also the downside of this feature of this application at the moment. It will support Dell, HP, and Lenovo, but at this moment, it only supports HP. And the main reason is that because Dell and Lenovo are much more complicated. So the Cloudway guys told us that they are implementing Dell and Lenovo, but it's not yet there. But I guess it will be released this in a few months or maybe sooner than we think. So it works very good. In the future, when it's built out for all vendors, I think this is my solution to go, because you can manage multiple vendors from one solution and you don't need all the different solutions for the specific vendors to manually manage. On top of that, they've created a workbook that lies on top of a log analytics workspace. So also with proactive remediations in combination with an Azure Function app, they are pushing information from the device to the log analytics workspace. On top of the log analytics workspace, there is this workbook that will give you great insights in all the types of devices that are being used in the organization, but also their firmware version, the firmware version that's available, the age of the firmware version. So you get a lot of insights on what's happening in your network. So when you're doing nothing with firmware at this moment, try to start implementing this, because it will give you great visualization of everything that's happening. Maybe one key to tell me here, this workbook, it's just a proactive remediation script with an Azure function, so you can use this without using the driver automation tool. So this can be run without any tools we talked about today. It's just getting the information and pushing it to the log analytics workspace. The driver automation tool isn't as fast as its vendor-specific tools. It's pretty fast, yes, but it all depends on the way how you do the proactive remediations. So when you're using the driver automation tool and you click push, on that moment the XML gets pushed to the storage account in Azure. Of course, when is the client going to do its things? It's on the proactive remediation schedule. So when you schedule it once a day or once a week, it all depends on that. So it's fast, but it depends on the proactive remediations. So the workbook, definitely try it. It's free. It's on Microsoft Endpoint Manager.com. Works great. So when we have a look at this solution, It's automated, yes. We can definitely automate the updates and the configuration of the updates. Update rings are available, but also, yet again, it's assigning the correct groups. Reporting is available through the Log Analytics workspace with the workbook, and it's very easy to use. So in my opinion, it checks all boxes at this moment. So what's next? Next up is the driver and firmware updates natively into Microsoft Endpoint Manager. About a year ago, I think it was March 2021, Microsoft announced a solution that will be included in Endpoint Manager that can be used to update drivers and update firmwares and even configure firmware. It's been announced more than a year ago, so we're still waiting for it. So the amount of information we have on this solution is pretty limited at this moment. But they published a new roadmap and it should come available this year. The private preview is already started. I'm not in the private preview. Thijs is also not in the private preview, so we can't give any more information on that. But it's coming, and we're excited for it. So the main question, of course, is, are we going to need extra licenses, or is it included in the E3 or the business premium or stuff like that? But it's just waiting on more information from Microsoft. So conclusion, there are a lot of solutions. Most of the solutions are a bit lacking. They are a bit too complex to manage on a daily basis. HP has the best solutions, but I think the main thing you need to conclude is that firmware management is needed, it's required, and you shouldn't forget it. I don't know, Thijs, do you have anything to add on that?
No, it was great to have this overview. I hope it provided lots of insights. It's a ton of information, and I think that also just concludes it. And we have high hopes for both the community solution, which is a free solution, which could alleviate some of the issues, or the Microsoft provided solution, which could help us. But of course, licensing is a big issue. I am willing to bet that this is not going to be included in a E3 license.
All right. Thank you.
We had some questions in chat. Some of them are already answered. But I think we can start at the top if we still have time, Wim.
Yeah, just go ahead.
Okay, thank
you. All good for us. I think there was one at the bottom, Thijs, you missed. Someone just put a question at the bottom of the chat, I think.
They're asking, where do you put the priority in a small-sized company to manage the firmware updates? I think in a small company, it's possible to do it through Windows Update for Business, because the chance that anything is going wrong, they're pretty limited. So in small companies, you can definitely do this. Bigger companies, you need to do update rings, you need to have visibility. So in bigger companies, you definitely should have a look to the solution that are available. But my opinion, if the company is big or small, firmware updates stay important. So even if the company is only 10 devices, you should update those firmwares. My opinion.
It's a lot of effort to just include the drivers button in Windows Update for Business. And if you don't have any other solution, it's the best bang for your buck.